And I guess I still have more time.
I think if you would like to speak more, you have more time. Unless you'd like to, we can
That's
go right into.
David, if you can try to answer that, you're welcome to have more time.
We could transition right into David the 12-minute portion. Right, we'll call it approximately 12 minutes, just to have a conversation back and forth, a little bit of a crossfire. And David, we'll go ahead and start with you if you want to go ahead and respond to anything that's been just that Robert has just said.
Oh, I'd like to respond to several things, but before I blast Robert, I wanted to address something very quickly that's a point that we agree on, and I've seen lots of people, like in comments sections and so on blogs and so on, who don't seem to get this point. We're saying that there should be a lot of evidence, a lot of early evidence for Muhammad if the basic Muslim story is accurate, and people keep reciting this little phrase, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. In other words, just because you don't have this early evidence doesn't mean nothing was happening there. And that is a valid principle in certain contexts, but this isn't one of them. In other words, it depends on the situation. For instance, if I said, hey, I look around the room, I don't see an elephant, therefore I conclude that there's no elephant here. The reason that would be justified is an elephant is a massive creature. If one were in the room, I would expect to see it. I would have good reason to expect to see it. But if I looked around the room and I said, I don't see any insects, I don't see any bugs, therefore there are no bugs, that wouldn't be a fair inference, because if there were a bug behind a dresser or something like that, or under a chair, I wouldn't expect to see it. So it depends on the situation, and what we're saying about Muhammad is we're not talking about some random individual. We're talking about someone who sent out all these followers who are conquering in his name, who are doing all kinds of things, and since they're spreading all throughout Arabia and into other places, we should have lots of records of this because it was such a massive event, and we don't, and that's a problem. So, Robert, I was wondering what you think of this idea that we're unjustified in saying that there should be this evidence there because absence of evidence is not evidence of absence.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very important point. And I can tell you this. If there were no records of any kind from that period, then the people who say absence of evidence is not evidence of absence would have a point. Because we would say, well, we simply don't know what happened at this time, but we have all this Islamic material. We can give it the benefit of the doubt. But actually, we do have an abundance of recorded information from the period in which the early Arabs were conquering. And for example, take Sophronius of Jerusalem. According to the Muslim account, the Patriarch of Jerusalem, Sophronius, he met the Caliph Umar at the gates of Jerusalem and gave him the key to the city after Umar had conquered Jerusalem. This is around 636 or 637, and supposedly 4 or 5 years after Muhammad died. And Umar walked around Jerusalem with Sophronius, but he declined to go inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and pray. And this is supposed to be evidence of early Muslim magnanimity, because Umar knew that if he went into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and prayed, that the Muslims would convert it into a mosque. So out of generosity and respect for the Christians, he didn't go in there and pray. Now, that's a great story. It's a famous story. It also has no historical reliability at all. We first hear that story several hundred years after the events it's supposed to recount. But we have letters and sermons of Sophronius himself that have survived. And in them, he speaks very movingly about how the Saracens, the Ishmaelites, came and laid waste, and how they conquered the area, and how he sees it as God's judgment upon the Christians of his day. But one thing he never says, several things he never says. He never says the Muslims came and conquered. He never calls them Muslims. He shows no awareness that they had a holy book. He shows no awareness that they had a prophet. He shows no awareness that they came with a new religion. This is extraordinary. This guy was actually conquered by these people, and he's writing about the conquest. And so that is not absence of evidence. That is positive evidence that the people who conquered Jerusalem were not actually Muslims at all, and that Muhammad did not exist yet, and the Quran did not exist yet, because if they did, there is absolutely no reason why Sophronius would not have mentioned them.
All right, Robert, now I want to address your claim that these stories weren't embarrassing to the early Muslim community, because I think they were all embarrassing to the early Muslim community. I think we're reading the sources a little differently. I'm not going off of straightforward claims that these were embarrassing. I'm kind of comparing the narrations and connecting the dots. For instance, I can open up one narration from the hadith, and it will say Muhammad was the victim of black magic because of a spell cast on him. And that's it. That would be the whole story. And eventually he snapped out of it. And then I go to another story, and Muhammad snaps out of it because, you know, some kind of angels show up and stuff and snap him out of it. And then I go to another version of the story, and Muhammad's victorious, and he says, go to the well and you'll find the hairbrush, and here's who did it, and so on. And so I have these stories in front of me, and I say, you know, the original story about Muhammad just being the victim of black magic, you wouldn't have left out that later vindication. You wouldn't have left out that later vindication if you were aware of it. So I'm looking at this, and I'm kind of arranging them in my mind of, obviously, the original story is, you know, just included Muhammad being the victim of black magic, and he eventually snapped out of it and blamed someone. And then it's later stories where there's something miraculous about it, some kind of miraculous vindication. And so I reason that the early story wouldn't have left that out if there was this extra information. So I'm putting them in a historical development, and I'm saying, well, if someone's obviously inventing this extra vindication, it's because the earlier story was embarrassing to the early Muslim community. And since it was embarrassing, why would someone invent it? And I would say that's the case with all of these stories, that if you compare the different versions, you look at more and more as time goes on, they're trying to vindicate Muhammad. And if they're trying to vindicate him and defend him, obviously they were embarrassing to the early Muslim community. And therefore, I wonder, you know, if we have the freedom to invent things, why are we inventing these things that are so embarrassing that people are expanding on them through legendary development?
Okay, very good point. However, it has to be emphasized that you are the one who are seeing the three different versions of the story and saying the one that simply says Muhammad was the victim of black magic has to have been the original, because it doesn't contain the justification of Muhammad. And that, however, when we come to the sources, we know that they're all just there in the Hadith. And there's no indication, actually, from the Hadith itself that that was the original version of the story. That actually could be the last version of the story. Now, why would that be the last version of the story? Well, there are any number of reasons. It could be a fragment. It could be an abbreviation. It could be something that was put there for some other reason. But the idea that that was necessarily the original version of the story, and that the elaborations justifying Muhammad came later, that is something that you are imposing upon the evidence from without. Because actually we have no way of knowing what the original version of the story was. All of the stories are late. All of the stories come in material that is part of this sudden proliferation and explosion of material about Muhammad that arises in the 9th century, when actually before that we don't know anything about him at all. It also may be that the figure of Muhammad in the Hadith and in Islamic tradition in general is a composite of several figures, and that material was taken from material about other people who may have done some of the things that Muhammad did, or Muhammad is said to have done, and who may have actually left traces in the memory of the people who are recounting. These things were not invented out of nothing. The Arab leaders, when they invented Islam, beginning in the 690s and stepping up in energy in the 8th century and particularly in the 9th century, they didn't just sit down and make these things up out of their heads. They used existing material. We can see very clearly in the Quran that they used existing Jewish and Christian sources primarily. But also in the Hadith, it is very likely that they drew upon accounts of various figures, various heroes, various famous figures among the Arabs, and used them to create Muhammad. And so it's possible that these things, that it might be that that was the original version of the story, but even that wouldn't get you any closer to a historical Muhammad than we already were to start with.
All right, now I want to point out a kind of shift in your methodology. When you were initially responding to these embarrassing stories, you were saying, here are clear reasons why someone would invent these stories. And now you're saying of at least some of the points, the embellishment on the story of the black magic and so on, that we just don't know. There could be a reason why things are reversed and not the way they appear in my mind. There could be a reason, and we just don't know it. Well, that goes into me weighing these options. If I sit here and I say, here are various accounts, and I can put them in a certain order, and it makes perfect sense why they would develop in that way. In other words, Muhammad really was not necessarily the victim of black magic. I don't necessarily believe that was true. But he was acting weird for a while. He snapped out of it and he says, someone cast a spell on me, in order to explain why he was the victim of this black magic. Later, Muslims saw this as kind of an embarrassing story, and they wanted to attach various miraculous endings onto the story. I look at that and I say, that makes sense. I can understand that historical development. So now I have something that makes perfect sense in my mind, but it presupposes that Muhammad existed. In other words, if that account is correct, it involves Muhammad's existence as the sort of start, as the beginning of that process. Your response is, well, you don't know that the short version that doesn't have a miraculous ending, that could have been the last, and we just don't know why. We just don't know why that is. Well, now I can't even make sense of it. And I will grant, just to be clear, I will grant that it's possible. I grant that lots of things are possible. But if I have one hypothesis that's very clear and involves a clear progression, and I can understand each of the steps, and I understand why these things happen, I understand the progression, and then the alternative is something I say, well, I can't make sense of that at all, but maybe it's true. Well, I'm inclined to go with the one that makes sense. I'm inclined to go with the one that makes clear sense in my mind. And I want to point out, it's not just this one story. It's not just this one story. If it were one story, if we had one story to deal with, or two or three, then I might say, maybe we could explain these things away. But when we have a ton of stories, I look at this and I say, that is not the picture of a prophet I would ever want to come up with. And to say, well, maybe they saw things differently, when I can't understand why anyone in his right mind, out of his right mind, would invent these things, then I have to go with what makes most sense. And what makes most sense to me is these things happened, they were embarrassing, and later Muslims tried to explain them away.
Sure, absolutely. That is a possibility. The thing is that one thing I would caution you about is that what makes sense is not necessarily what happened, especially when we're dealing with this material. This is extraordinarily strange material, and there are all sorts of oddities about it. And I'm not sure that making sense, it might be, but I'm not convinced myself that making sense is a compelling argument in this case because of the strangeness of this material. And I would say I don't think there's a shift in my methodology at all. These things, I think, in a tremendous degree were invented. Actually, as you know, the Muslim scholars themselves, in explaining the forged hadith, acknowledge that a huge number, I mean, we're talking hundreds of thousands, like the 297,000 hadith that Bukhari collected and then rejected as inauthentic, were manufactured for political reasons, for political motives. And that the only criteria by which he decided that the 3,000 that he did use were authentic was the chain of transmitters, which of course could just as easily be forged as well as the story. And so we're talking about a huge proliferation of material that's acknowledged to have been forged for political reasons. And all I'm saying is we might be able to discern the reasons why various stories were developed in some cases. We might not be able to tell why stories were developed in some cases because we don't have all the information at hand. And it may be that some of them refer to historical figures who were used to make up the figure of Muhammad, but the yawning historical gap between the time that Muhammad is supposed to have lived and when these stories first appear make it very unlikely that, however embarrassing they may be and however much your reconstruction of events makes sense, it still is very unlikely that they refer to a historical Muhammad, because if they did, then one would expect, as we have discussed, there to have been some mention of this fellow long before we ever hear anything about him.
Okay, we're going to have to sneak in here a quick break. Robert and David, thank you for the continued ongoing discussion here of tonight's topic, which is, did Muhammad exist?